She sat in her office, staring at the city lights through the tall glass window. The night had already covered the sky, but her desk was still full of reports waiting for her attention. The sound of her phone buzzing every few seconds reminded her that she didn't have time to rest. Everyone around her called her a perfectionist. To the world, she was the woman who had everything: wealth, power, respect, and a company that depended on her every decision. But only she knew how quiet her world really was when the office lights went off. Every morning, she woke before the sun and prepared herself for another day of endless meetings, tight deadlines, and people who only saw her as a boss. Her life looked glamorous from the outside, but she often felt like a stranger in her own success. The luxury apartment she lived in was spotless, but it didn't feel like home. There were no sounds of laughter, no smell of coffee brewed by someone else, no voice asking how her day had been. It was just her and her tired thoughts. She wasn't always this way. Years ago, she had dreamed of building something meaningful, something her late mother would have been proud of. Her mother had been her strength, her biggest supporter, and when she passed away, something inside her broke. That was the moment she decided that emotions only caused pain, so she buried them deep and replaced them with goals. She poured her heart into her work, and the more successful she became, the more distant she felt from herself. People often said she was intimidating. Her staff admired her, but no one truly knew her. She had learned to smile even when she wanted to cry. She had learned to act confident even when her chest felt heavy with loneliness. At meetings, she spoke clearly and decisively, earning respect and fear at the same time. But when she came home at night, she would remove her heels, lean against the cold kitchen counter, and let the silence swallow her whole. There had been someone once, a man who had promised her forever. But he couldn't handle the walls she built around her heart. He wanted to be let in, but she didn't know how. Eventually, he left, saying he couldn't keep loving someone who didn't believe in love anymore. She told herself she didn't need anyone. She convinced herself that she was fine, that love only distracted people from their purpose. But deep down, she missed the sound of laughter, the touch of warmth, the feeling of being seen for who she truly was. One night, after a long day at work, she sat by her window with a cup of tea that had gone cold. Her laptop screen was still glowing, filled with numbers and charts. She tried to focus, but her mind wandered to the life she once imagined, one that didn't revolve around deadlines and deals. She thought about her mother's voice telling her to slow down, to breathe, to live, but she didn't know how anymore. Her identity was built on strength, and she didn't know how to be anything else. The next morning, she arrived at the office early as usual. The receptionist greeted her nervously, like always. Her assistant handed her the schedule for the day, a list so long it almost made her sigh. But she didn't. She had trained herself not to show weakness. At the meeting, she spoke about expansion plans, partnerships, and profit margins. She made decisions that would affect hundreds of employees without showing a flicker of doubt. When the meeting ended, people clapped, some smiled, and everyone left the room proud to work under her. She sat there staring at the empty chair across from her, and wondered when she last felt proud of herself. In the afternoon, one of her managers mentioned a community project proposal that needed her approval. It involved sponsoring an art event for underprivileged children at a local school. She almost brushed it aside. Charity events weren't something she personally handled, but something about the project caught her attention. The proposal had a note attached. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes. She didn't know why that line stayed with her, but it did. Later that night, she looked up the details. The event was simple, a local art fair for children and families supported by small businesses and community volunteers. It wasn't a major partnership or a big publicity opportunity. It was just something pure, something human. For reasons she couldn't explain, she decided she would attend personally. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe she just needed to see something real for once. When the day came, she arrived at the school wearing her usual suit, trying to blend confidence with approachability. The place was full of colors and laughter. Children ran around with paintbrushes. Parents chatted in groups, and the smell of fresh paint mixed with the sound of music. It was a world completely different from hers, messy, loud, and full of warmth. For a moment, she felt out of place. A little girl bumped into her, leaving a streak of blue paint on her skirt. The child froze, eyes wide with fear. But instead of scolding her, the CEO smiled. A real, gentle smile she hadn't felt in a long time. "It's all right," she said softly. It's just paint. The little girl smiled back, and for a moment something inside the woman loosened. As she walked further into the event, she saw a man surrounded by children. He was showing them how to mix colors, his hands covered in paint, his voice calm and warm. The children laughed at his jokes, and even the parents nearby seemed relaxed around him. She didn't know who he was, but there was something different about him. He didn't seem to care about impressing anyone. He looked happy, genuinely happy. He noticed her standing there, slightly distant from the crowd. He gave her a nod and a kind smile, the kind that wasn't forced or professional. For some reason, that simple gesture caught her off guard. She wasn't used to being seen like that. Not as a CEO, but as a person. She gave a small nod back and turned away, pretending to focus on the children's artwork. But her heart felt strange. As the day went on, she found herself watching how freely everyone interacted. The laughter, the mistakes, the joy, it all felt so natural. She realized how much of her own life was built around control and perfection. Here, no one cared about being perfect. The paint smudges, the uneven drawings, the noisy chatter, all of it was beautiful in its own way. When the event ended, the man she had noticed earlier came over to thank her for sponsoring the program. He introduced himself as one of the teachers who helped organize the art classes. His tone was calm, his words sincere. He spoke about how much the children enjoyed expressing themselves, and how art helped them feel seen and understood. She listened quietly, nodding, surprised at how his words affected her. He asked if she painted. She almost laughed. "No," she said. "I don't really have time for that." He smiled gently. "Maybe you should try sometime. You might be surprised at how much color your life already has. You just stopped noticing it." His words stayed with her long after she left. That night, as she sat alone again in her quiet apartment, she looked at her hands and wondered when was the last time they had created something just for joy. Not a business plan, not a signature, not a decision, but something simple, something real. The city lights outside her window looked different that night. Maybe nothing had changed, but she felt something stir inside her. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there, a feeling she hadn't known for years. For the first time in a long time, she didn't open her laptop after dinner. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat on the couch, and just let the silence stay. But this time the silence didn't feel as cold as before. Somewhere deep down, she could still hear the laughter from that schoolyard, the sound of children painting, the warmth in that man's voice, the soft blue mark on her skirt. It all felt like the beginning of something she couldn't name yet. She didn't know it then, but that simple decision to attend an art event would change the way she saw her life forever. The woman who once believed she needed no one was about to learn that sometimes healing doesn't come from strength, it comes from connection. And that connection had just quietly begun. The morning sunlight filtered through the old curtains, lighting up the small kitchen. He stood by the stove, flipping pancakes while his daughter sat at the table, humming to herself as she drew something on a piece of paper. The walls were covered with her drawings, flowers, stars, animals, and faces smiling back at them. The house was small, but it felt full of life. There was a warmth here that no amount of money could buy. He turned and smiled at the little girl. "That's a new picture, isn't it?" he asked, placing a pancake on her plate. She nodded eagerly. "It's us," she said proudly, pointing at two stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. "You said we'd go to the park today," he laughed softly. "And we will." After breakfast, for him, these simple mornings were everything. Life hadn't always been this peaceful. There had been a time when the silence in this house hurt. After his wife passed away, the walls seemed to close in. He had struggled for months, pretending to be fine for his daughter while breaking inside. There were nights when he would sit in the dark, holding her tiny hand while she slept, promising himself that he would find a way to smile again, for her sake. He never imagined he'd raise a child alone. His wife had been his best friend, his biggest comfort, and losing her had felt like losing half of himself. But slowly, over the years, the pain softened. He learned that grief didn't disappear, it simply became part of who you are. And he found a strange kind of healing in his daughter's laughter, in her innocent questions, in the way she made every little thing feel magical again. He had left his corporate job after her passing, realizing that money couldn't bring peace. He decided to become an art teacher at a local school. It didn't pay much, but it gave him purpose. Every day, He helped children express what they couldn't say in words. Paint, clay, crayons, they were tools for healing. He understood that better than anyone. That weekend, as he and his daughter walked to the park, he couldn't help but think about the woman he met at the school event a few days earlier. The elegant CEO who stood out in the middle of that noisy crowd. She had carried herself with confidence, yet her eyes had something heavy behind them, something he recognized. Pain hidden behind perfection. He didn't know her story, but he sensed she was someone who rarely let her guard down. And still, when she smiled at that little girl who had spilled paint on her, it had been genuine. He didn't expect to see her again, but something told him that wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Days turned into weeks, and life carried on as usual. His days were filled with classes, laughter, and messy art projects. Every so often, he thought about the CEO and wondered if she ever thought about that day at the school. He doubted it. Someone like her must have been too busy for such small memories. But one afternoon, as he was cleaning up after class, he noticed a familiar car parked outside the school gates. It was sleek and black, nothing like the simple cars most parents drove. He didn't pay much attention until he saw her step out. She looked different this time, less guarded, almost hesitant. She walked toward him, holding a folder in her hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said politely. "Not at all," he replied with a smile. "You're back for round 2 of messy art?" She chuckled softly, the sound light but unsure. "Not exactly. I wanted to talk about expanding the program. The event was meaningful. I'd like to do more." He noticed the way she spoke, measured, professional, but there was sincerity beneath it. "That's great," he said. "The kids loved it. We've been wanting to hold regular workshops, but funding is always a problem." "Funding isn't the issue anymore," she said, almost too quickly. "I'll take care of that." He looked at her curiously. "You don't have to do that. The event already made a big difference." She hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment. "It's not about obligation," she said softly. I think it's time I did something that actually matters." He didn't press her, but he understood more than she realized. Sometimes people with everything still felt empty. Maybe she was searching for meaning in the noise of her own life. He knew what that felt like. Over the next few weeks, they worked together on organizing more community programs. She visited the school more often, talking to teachers, helping with supplies, and even joining the art sessions occasionally. At first she was distant, observing quietly while keeping her hands clean. But little by little she began to loosen up. One afternoon, while helping a group of children paint a mural, she accidentally got color on her hand. The children giggled and she laughed too, a real carefree laugh that surprised even her. He caught her smile and couldn't help but grin. "Looks good on you," he said, nodding toward the streak of paint on her wrist. She rolled her eyes playfully. "I don't think I'm built for this kind of mess," he replied. "Sometimes a little mess is good. It reminds us we're human." That made her pause. She didn't say anything, but his words stayed with her long after. She started visiting the school even when she didn't have to. Sometimes she brought snacks for the children or watched them paint. Other times she'd simply sit quietly, listening to the chatter and laughter around her. She found peace in their innocence, a kind of calm she hadn't known in years. One day, as the class ended, she helped him stack the paint trays. "You seem to really love what you do," she said. He smiled. "I do. It doesn't make me rich, but it makes me happy." She nodded slowly. "That's something I've been missing. I used to think success was about how high you climb, not how full you feel inside." He looked at her kindly. "Maybe you were climbing the wrong mountain." That simple line hit her harder than she expected. She had spent years climbing without ever asking where it led. Over time, she began opening up more. She told him about her mother, about the loss that changed her, about how she buried herself in work to escape pain. He listened quietly, never interrupting, never judging. She wasn't used to that. Most people either pitied her or tried to fix her. But he just listened, and somehow that was enough. In return, he shared parts of his story too. He told her about his wife, about the accident, about the years it took to find peace again. When he spoke, there was sadness in his eyes, but also acceptance. "Pain doesn't disappear," he said. "It just changes shape. One day it stops hurting and starts teaching." His words stayed with her. She admired the way he had turned loss into love, how he had built a world out of kindness and art. He wasn't rich or powerful, yet he seemed freer than anyone she knew. Their connection grew naturally. There was no rush, no expectation, just two people who had both lost something learning how to breathe again. Sometimes they'd share coffee after class, talking about life, laughter, and the little things that made it beautiful. One rainy afternoon, as they waited for the children's parents to pick them up, she found herself looking out the window, lost in thought. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to hate the rain. It made me feel lonely. But lately, it feels different." He looked at her curiously. "Different how?" "Like it's washing something away," she said. He smiled. "Maybe it's washing away the things that no longer belong." She turned to him then, her eyes soft, full of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just helping others heal. She was healing too. The emptiness inside her didn't feel as heavy anymore. The late nights didn't hurt as much. Her apartment didn't seem as cold. She began seeing beauty in simple things: the laughter of children, the sound of rain, the smell of paint, the warmth of shared silence. And somehow, through all of it, she began to rediscover herself, the part she had buried under years of pressure and pain. She didn't know where this new connection would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. For the first time in a long while, she felt alive. And it all started with a man who didn't try to fix her, but simply reminded her that life could still be beautiful. The following weeks unfolded like quiet waves, each one bringing a small change she didn't fully notice at first. The woman who once counted her worth in meetings and profit charts now found herself watching the clock in her office, waiting for the afternoons when she could leave early and visit the school. It had become her favorite escape, a place where no one called her ma'am or treated her like someone unreachable. At the school, the world felt slower, kinder. The air smelled like crayons and paint. The walls were covered with colorful drawings that looked like stories told by tiny dreamers. It reminded her of what life looked like before everything became so serious. The children welcomed her now. They didn't care that she was the CEO of a big company. To them, she was the tall lady who brought cookies and sometimes tried to paint, even though her lines never came out straight. The man noticed her transformation quietly. He didn't say much about it, but he saw how she laughed more freely, how her shoulders weren't as tense, and how her eyes no longer looked lost. He admired the strength she carried, the kind of strength that didn't shout but endured. There was something deeply human about the way she was slowly learning to live again. One afternoon, she arrived at the school a little earlier than usual. The art class hadn't started yet, and the man was busy setting up brushes and colors on the long wooden table. He looked up as she entered. "You're early," he said with a light smile. "I needed a break," she admitted, setting her bag down. "The board meeting was endless. I thought I'd rather be here than listening to people argue about numbers." He chuckled. "Art is a much better meeting." She looked at the colors on the table. "You really believe that?" "Of course," he said. "Art teaches you what numbers can't: patience, imagination, peace." She thought about that for a moment. "I don't remember the last time I felt peaceful." He handed her a brush. "Then maybe today's the day," she laughed softly. "You're persistent." "I'm patient," he corrected. "There's a difference." They spent that afternoon painting together. The children were loud and playful, spilling water and mixing colors that didn't belong together. But it didn't matter. The noise was warm. It was the kind that made the heart feel less alone. He guided her hand once when she hesitated over the brushstroke, and for a second the world seemed to slow down. His touch was gentle, nothing more than a simple act of help, but it carried kindness she hadn't felt in years. When she finished, her painting looked uneven and messy, but she smiled anyway. "It's terrible," she said. "It's honest," he replied. "That's better." That night when she went home, she placed the painting on her kitchen counter instead of throwing it away. Every time she looked at it, she felt something she couldn't explain, a mix of calm and warmth. It was as if she had left a small piece of herself in those colors. Days turned into weeks, and her connection with him deepened naturally. They never forced conversation, yet talking to him felt effortless. Sometimes they spoke about big things, lost dreams, regrets, and other times they talked about the little things that made life soft, like morning coffee or the sound of rain. He had a quiet way of listening that made her feel understood. She hadn't realized how much she needed that until now. One afternoon, as the school day ended, he invited her to join him and his daughter for a small picnic at the park nearby. She hesitated at first, worried about crossing invisible lines between her world and his, but his daughter's wide smile made it impossible to say no. At the park, the air smelled of grass and sunlight. The little girl ran around chasing butterflies while he spread a blanket on the ground. She sat beside him, feeling strangely comfortable in this simplicity. He handed her a sandwich, and for the first time in a long while, she ate without rushing. His daughter returned with a daisy in her hand and placed it in the woman's hair. "You look pretty now," she said proudly. The woman laughed, touched by the innocent gesture. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're very sweet." The man watched the exchange quietly, smiling. Seeing them together stirred something gentle inside him, something he hadn't felt since before his wife passed away. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something simpler, the quiet recognition of shared healing. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the woman found herself speaking softly. "Do you ever get scared?" she asked. "Of what?" "Of losing this peace you've built." He looked at the horizon for a moment before answering. "All the time," he said. "But peace isn't something you hold on to. It's something you choose every day, even when life feels heavy." She nodded, his words settling deep in her heart. For someone who once believed control was the only way to survive, the idea of letting go felt both terrifying and freeing. When they parted ways that evening, she went home with the faint smell of grass on her clothes and the sound of laughter echoing in her mind. Her apartment didn't feel as cold that night. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. For once, she didn't open her laptop. She just looked at the city lights and smiled without realizing it. Over the next few weeks, she found herself making small changes. She started leaving work earlier, taking short walks after dinner, even cooking simple meals instead of ordering takeout. She began calling her employees by name, asking about their families, and really listening to their answers. People at the company noticed the change. She seemed lighter, warmer, more human. One of her assistants even whispered to a coworker, "She's smiling more these days. Something's different about her." But she didn't tell anyone about the man or the school. That part of her life felt too personal, too precious. It wasn't a secret. It was simply something she wanted to protect. One afternoon, while reviewing some reports in her office, she noticed the photo of her mother on her desk. For the first time in years, she didn't feel sadness looking at it. Instead, she felt gratitude. Her mother had always told her that love was what made life meaningful. Maybe she was finally beginning to understand what that meant. A few days later, she went to the school again, but this time she brought something new. Boxes of art supplies, sketchbooks, and a small easel she had purchased herself. The children's faces lit up with excitement. The man looked at her with quiet appreciation. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly. "I wanted to," she replied. "This place gives me more than I can ever give it." He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at her said enough. It wasn't admiration for her money or her position. It was respect for the heart she was slowly uncovering. Later that day, as they stood outside the classroom watching the children paint, he said something that made her stop. "You know," he said gently, "you're changing. You're not hiding anymore." She looked at him surprised. "Hiding?" He nodded. "The first day I met you, you stood like someone who was afraid to be seen. Now you walk like someone who belongs." She didn't know how to respond, but his words stayed with her all the way home. She had spent so many years building walls that she had forgotten how it felt to be seen without fear. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about him. His calm voice, his steady kindness, the way he looked at life without bitterness. He had lost so much, yet he carried peace in his eyes, and somehow he had shared a piece of that peace with her. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Did he see the successful woman everyone admired? Or the fragile one who was finally learning how to breathe again? Maybe both. When she finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of the park, of the sound of laughter, of paint-covered hands, and the faint scent of daisies. For the first time in years, her dreams weren't filled with deadlines or pressure. They were filled with life. The next morning, as she drove to work, she noticed something simple, yet powerful. The city, which always looked gray to her, seemed brighter. The same roads, the same buildings, but now they looked alive. Maybe nothing outside had changed. but something inside her surely had. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew one thing. She wanted to keep feeling this way. Open, light and real, and somewhere deep inside, she also knew that the man who taught her to see life again wasn't just a passing chapter. He was becoming part of her story, the part that mattered most. The days that followed moved gently like soft waves brushing the shore. Life was changing for both of them, though neither said it out loud. She was no longer the woman who hid behind her polished smile and perfect schedule. Her world had color now, and she could feel again. He was no longer just the quiet art teacher who kept his heart locked away in memories. Somehow her presence had begun to fill the silent corners of his life too. They didn't need to say much to understand each other. Sometimes their conversations were full of laughter. Other times they were wrapped in calm silence. The comfort between them didn't come from grand gestures, but from the way they simply existed together, without judgment, without expectations. One afternoon, she visited the school as usual, but this time, she found him sitting alone in the art room after class. The tables were messy with leftover brushes and scraps of paper. His daughter had already gone home with a neighbor, and he was lost in thought. "You look like you're miles away," she said softly, placing her bag on a chair. He smiled faintly. "Just thinking," he replied. "About what?" "About how fast time moves. About how some days feel heavy and others feel light. Today's one of the lighter ones." She sat across from him, watching the late sunlight fall across his face. "You always manage to see something good even in quiet moments." He shrugged gently. "I guess I learned to. When you've known real loss, you stop waiting for perfect days. You start being grateful for the peaceful ones." His words hit her deeply. She thought about her own life. How many years she had spent chasing perfection, running from silence, afraid to stop. Now, sitting in that messy classroom, she realized peace didn't live in achievement. It lived in these small, honest moments. They stayed there for a long time, not talking much, just sharing the quiet. At one point, he began packing away the brushes, and she helped him. It was such a simple act, but it felt strangely intimate, like two people taking care of something fragile together. When they finished, he said quietly, "You've changed, you know." She smiled faintly. "You keep saying that." "It's true," he replied. "You don't wear that invisible armor anymore." She looked down for a moment. "Maybe I just got tired of pretending," he nodded. "That's a good kind of tired." For a moment, neither of them said anything. But there was a softness between them that didn't need words. She left the school that evening feeling lighter than she had in years. The following weekend, the school organized a small outdoor art fair to raise funds for more supplies. She offered to help again, not as a sponsor this time, but as part of the team. She spent the whole morning arranging booths, carrying boxes, and laughing with parents. The children ran around with paint on their faces, showing off their colorful masterpieces. When the event started, she found herself standing beside him, handing out paintbrushes to kids. "This is chaos," she said with a laugh as a child spilled water on her shoe. He grinned. "Beautiful chaos." She shook her head but smiled anyway. "You really do see beauty everywhere, don't you?" He looked at her then, really looked. "Not everywhere," he said softly. "Just where it's real." Her breath caught for a second and she turned away, pretending to focus on the kids. But inside something stirred. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Later that afternoon, when the event ended, everyone began packing up. A few raindrops started to fall, turning into a light drizzle. The children ran for shelter, squealing with laughter. He and she rushed to cover the tables, laughing as they got soaked. "This rain always finds a way to join the party," he joked, pushing his wet hair back. She laughed, shaking the water from her hands. "I think it's testing us." "Well," he said with a smile, "we passed." They ended up standing under a small shed near the playground, watching the rain pour down. The air smelled of wet earth and paint. She looked at him quietly and said, "You know, I used to hate the rain. It always felt lonely. And now?" he asked. "Now it feels peaceful." He smiled softly. "Then maybe it's not the rain that changed. Maybe you did." She looked at him for a long moment. The world around them blurred into the sound of raindrops. She realized that she hadn't felt this safe and this seen in years. When the rain stopped, they walked to their cars together, still damp, but smiling. Before she got in, she turned to him and said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me that life can still be gentle, He looked at her with quiet warmth. You did that yourself. I just held up the mirror. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying their conversations in her mind. The way he looked at her. The way his words always seemed to find the quietest parts of her heart. She wasn't used to needing anyone, but this didn't feel like need. It felt like belonging. The next few days were busy at work. Deadlines, meetings, and constant phone calls filled her hours again. But even in the middle of chaos, she found herself smiling at random moments. She'd remember the laughter at the art fair, the smell of rain, or the sound of his calm voice. Her assistant noticed the change. You seem happier lately, she said one morning. She paused, then smiled. Maybe I am. It wasn't that her problems disappeared. She still had challenges, pressure, and long nights. But now, there was balance. She was no longer trapped inside her work. She had someone, reminding her that life existed beyond her office walls. A few evenings later, she decided to stop by the school unannounced. The building was quiet. Classes had ended for the day. She found him sitting on a bench outside, sketching something in his notebook while his daughter played nearby. She approached quietly. You always draw after work? He looked up, smiling. When I can. It helps me breathe. She sat beside him, watching as he sketched a tree with simple, clean lines. You make it look easy. He handed her the pencil. Try, she laughed. No, I'll ruin it. You won't, he said gently. Art isn't about perfection. It's about truth. She hesitated, then took the pencil. Her hand moved awkwardly at first, but he didn't correct her. He just watched, patient as ever. When she finished, it wasn't perfect, but it was hers. He looked at it and smiled. See, told you. She smiled too. I still think it's terrible. Then it's honest, he replied, echoing his words from weeks ago. They both laughed softly, remembering that moment. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of pink, his daughter came running to them holding a small wildflower. It's for you, she told the woman. She took it gently. Thank you, sweetheart. The little girl smiled and ran off again, humming to herself. She likes you, he said quietly. I like her too, she replied. She reminds me what joy looks like. He turned to her then, his eyes warm and steady. And you remind me what hope looks like. The world seemed to pause for a moment. She didn't know what to say, so she simply smiled. But inside her heart felt full of gratitude, of something deeper she wasn't ready to name. That night, when she returned home, she placed the wildflower next to her messy painting on the counter. It looked small and fragile, but it carried meaning. It reminded her of simplicity, of kindness, of connection. She realized that what she felt wasn't sudden love. It was healing. The kind that comes slowly, softly, until one day you realize the weight you carried isn't there anymore. The woman who once hid her pain was now learning how to live again, not through success or power, but through moments that made her feel human. And though neither of them said it out loud, both knew something special was growing between them, something built not on need, but on understanding. The walls around her heart were no longer standing. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She didn't know what the next chapter would bring. But she knew one thing for sure. The man who had once been a stranger was slowly becoming the peace she never thought she'd find. The weeks passed, gentle and steady, like the quiet turning of a page in a long-forgotten book. She no longer measured her days by emails answered or meetings survived. Instead, she counted them by the small moments that brought her unexpected joy. The laugh of a child, the warmth of sunlight on her hands, the soft, comforting presence of someone who understood her without words. He had become a constant in her life, though she refused to call it anything more. She wasn't ready for that kind of certainty. For someone who had spent years hiding behind walls, even small steps of trust felt enormous. Yet she began to look forward to seeing him, to the calm rhythm of their days together, to the quiet moments when she could let her guard down completely. One afternoon, she arrived at the school for an art session. The children were busy with paints and clay, their laughter filling the room like music. He was at the back guiding a shy child to try a new color. When he saw her, his face lit up in that quiet, gentle way that made her heart feel unsteady. She smiled back, a real warm smile that reached her eyes. Good to see you, he said softly. You too, she replied. She set her bag down and joined the children, handing out brushes and kneeling to help with the mural. They didn't notice her hesitations or her careful movements. They only felt the kindness she offered, the attention she gave without judgment. After a while, she stood up and looked at the mural. The colors were bright and chaotic, but full of life. She thought about her own life and how messy it had been. How many years she had spent trying to color within invisible lines. Now, seeing the mural, she realized beauty didn't come from perfection. It came from honesty, from openness, from allowing life to spill over the edges. He approached her quietly, holding 2 cups of warm tea. "For you," he said, handing one to her. She accepted it with a small smile. "Thank you." They walked outside to the small garden behind the school. The sun was low, casting golden light across the leaves. They found a quiet bench and sat together, sipping the tea. Neither spoke immediately. It was enough to simply be near each other, to feel the comfort of shared silence. Finally, she broke the quiet. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked. He looked at her thoughtfully. "Sometimes," he said. "But I try not to get ahead of myself. Life is more about the moments we have now than the plans we make." She nodded, feeling the truth in his words. For years she had been planning, pushing, and controlling, trying to force a future that never felt satisfying. Now she was learning to live in the present, to feel rather than calculate. "I never thought I'd feel this light again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his expression soft. "You've always had it in you. You just needed to let it out." She smiled, a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. For the first time, she realized she didn't need to hide behind her strength or her title. She could be herself, messy, human, open to life. And it was enough. Over the next few days, they spent more time together outside the school. Sometimes they went for walks in the park. Sometimes they shared quiet meals at small cafes, and sometimes they simply sat in the same room, reading or sketching. Each moment was simple, but it carried a depth she had never experienced before. One evening, as they walked home from the park, he stopped and pointed to the sky. The stars were beginning to appear, delicate and distant. "Look," he said, "even the darkest night has its own light." She followed his gaze, feeling a strange calm settle over her. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed. "And it's constant. Even when we can't see it, it's still there." She thought about her life. The years of loneliness, the pain she had buried, the love she had thought she would never find. Maybe that was the truth he had always tried to show her. That light existed even in the dark moments, and it was okay to reach for it. A few days later, they found themselves organizing another art session together. The children laughed and painted, the colors spilling over the tables and walls. She laughed too, fully and freely, enjoying the chaos without worrying about control. He watched her with a quiet admiration, not for her position or her past accomplishments, but for the way she had allowed herself to feel alive again. During a break, she noticed him sitting with his daughter, sharing a quiet joke that made both of them giggle. She realized how effortlessly they belonged together, a family in a sense she hadn't known she longed for. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of connection she had never allowed herself to feel before. Later that evening, as she walked home, she thought about how far she had come. She had once believed that strength meant standing alone, that love was a distraction, and that vulnerability was weakness. Now she knew the opposite was true. Strength was allowing herself to feel. Love was a choice that could heal, and vulnerability was the doorway to connection. A few weeks later, she invited him to her apartment, not for business, not for planning, but simply to share a quiet evening together. She cooked a simple meal, something she rarely did, and they sat at her small dining table, laughing and talking about everything and nothing. At one point, he looked at her seriously. "You've changed," he said softly, "and I don't mean just in small ways. You carry yourself differently now. You've let yourself live again." She paused, feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. "I think you helped me see that life doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful." He reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. "You did the work yourself. I only reminded you that it was possible." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt the truth of his words sink in. He had never tried to fix her or make her someone else. He had only seen her in her entirety, and quietly encouraged her to see herself too. For the first time in years, she felt a clarity she hadn't thought possible. She wasn't defined by her work, her achievements, or her past pain. She was defined by her heart, by the small acts of kindness she shared, by the connections she allowed herself to nurture. As the night deepened, they moved to the couch, sitting close together. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady warmth of his presence. They didn't speak, words weren't necessary. The silence itself was comforting, filled with unspoken understanding. Over the next few months, their bond grew stronger. She visited his home more often, helping with meals, art projects, and bedtime stories. He became part of her life in ways that felt natural and gentle. The loneliness she had carried for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging she hadn't known she needed. She realized that love didn't have to be loud or dramatic. It didn't have to come with grand declarations or perfect timing. Sometimes love was quiet. It was sharing a cup of tea, laughing at small mistakes, supporting each other through the ordinary days, and for the first time she allowed herself to accept it. One evening, as they walked through a small garden near her apartment, he stopped and looked at her seriously. "I've never met anyone like you," he said softly. "You've been through so much, and yet you still care, still feel, still give. It's rare." She smiled, feeling a warmth that made her chest ache. "I've had help," she admitted, "from someone who reminded me how to be human again." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then we've both helped each other, haven't we?" She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. All the years of hiding, the fear, the loneliness, it all felt distant now, like a shadow she no longer needed to carry. They stood there for a long time, simply looking at each other. It wasn't a declaration or a proposal. It was something deeper, a quiet recognition of connection, trust, and care. That night, when she returned home, she didn't feel the familiar weight of emptiness. Her apartment was still quiet, but it no longer felt lonely. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking at the city lights. For the first time in years, she felt whole. She realized that she had found something she never thought she would, someone who saw her, understood her, and accepted her completely. The CEO who once hid her pain had finally met someone who helped her heal, not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of kindness, presence, and understanding. And in that realization, she finally understood what it meant to live again, fully, freely, and with a heart open to love. She smiled softly, whispering to herself, maybe life really does give second chances, when you're ready to see them. And somewhere, not far away, he was smiling too, thinking the same thing. For the first time, they both knew that happiness didn't come from perfection, power, or control. It came from connection, understanding, and the courage to allow themselves to be seen. Together, quietly and steadily, they had begun to heal. Together, they had begun to live, and that was enough.